What's up guys, and welcome back to another episode here on Full Throttle. My name is Charlie, and today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be pulling apart the front and rear timing covers as well as dropping the upper and lower oil pans. If you haven't seen the previous video, I've removed all the external accessories. I took off all the coolant piping and everything, and if you haven't seen that video and you want to check that one out first, then I'll leave that link in the description below. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by draining the oil. One of the first things you're going to want to do is have a clean work area. Make sure that this is free of any debris that may be on it before. It may be a wooden desk, it may be, in your garage, but make sure your work surface is clean and free of any debris. You don't want to contaminate your timing chains or any of the sprockets on the inside. I like to number each side, so 1 stands for bank 1, that's the passenger side, 2 stands for bank 2, that's the driver's side. I like to buy these little Ziploc bags on Amazon. You get a bunch of them and they're pretty cheap. I like to label everything, so the front timing chain case, the rear timing chain case, front VVT solenoids, upper oil pan and lower oil pan, just to keep track of all my hardware. So I've got my oil catch set up here so I can catch all the oil that drains. I'm going to start by draining the oil, then I'm going to remove the oil filter and the OEM oil cooler, then I'm going to start removing the lower oil pan so I can get access to the two 12mm screws that hold the front timing chain case cover on. If you want to see how I remove the front crank pulley, it's in my previous video that I just talked about. Alright, now you can see me removing the oil filter and draining the engine oil. The stud right here is a 22mm. Pop that off. And then you can remove the oil cooler. After removing the oil cooler, I started removing the 17mm that hold the subframe. And if the last video, I actually went over the strip top nut on the passenger side. And so I waited for that until I take off the exhaust manifolds. Now I'm flipping the engine so I can drain more of the oil. And there's a series of 10mm. You go in the reverse order of this diagram here. And so you start at 10, then you go to 9, etc. I like to use a small flathead screwdriver just for my initial, cutting into the gasket there. And then I use a seal cutter and actually wedge that in between the upper oil pan and the lower oil pan. Try not to drop it. And these are the two 12mm that hold the front timing chain case on. And I'm going to get those now. Then I'll use a gun to zip them off quickly. You might as well remove bolts 9 through 12 in reverse order, 12, 11, so forth, so you can remove both the front and rear timing chain case covers. Now these are the VTC solenoid covers. You remove them like 6, 5, 4, 3 in this diagram here. And I was actually missing number 2 on the left bank, but it's okay, I can replace it. Now this is pulling it off. Be careful not to drop the magnet. And the old gasket. So after you remove both VTC covers and the gaskets, you can move on to all of the 22 10mm screws and the leftover 17s that are on the front. You go in reverse order, just like all the other diagrams, 22, 21, 20, 19, so forth. And after you remove all these, your front timing chain case is actually ready to be taken off. And now that the 12s are removed in the upper oil pan and all these are removed, you're good to go. And these engines actually have a couple of different pry locations. So there's 2 up here on the top, there's 1 right here, and on the other side there's a piece of plastic that's covering it, but there's 1 right here, and after I remove this piece of plastic here, there's another 1 right here. And there's another location down on the side that I like to use, as well as on the other side. It's right here in between. Just try not to gouge the mating surfaces of both of the covers. After cleaning out the RTV in these 2 top locations, I like to alternate in between, the top and then the side, just to make sure I don't warp this front cover. You don't want to bend it in a way that it might not seal correctly when you put it back together. So I'll go from one side to the other side and back and forth, back up to the top. And sometimes they're not the easiest to get off. This one wasn't that easy, but they'll come off. Okay. And what I like to double check is that my lobes are at top dead center. Both of them are at top dead center right here. And I'll go back down and I'll check the crankshaft and make sure that is at top dead center. And we'll be ready to start taking apart all of the timing components. Alright, so now it's time for the fun part. So I've got a paper clip here. I've got a couple more paper clips here because I'm going to need one for this secondary timing chain, and I'm going to need one for the other side secondary timing chain. And then I've got one for the primary timing chain. I'm going to stick it right here, and this is to hold it. I'm going to loosen the top bolt and then loosen the second bolt, and then after I fully remove the secondary, it's going to flip down just like this. And then I can remove the top bolt completely, and that pin is going to hold the plunger from pulling out completely. And even if it goes out completely, you can always reset these. So this one you can reset, but the other secondary ones you can't reset. So now I'm removing the upper timing chain guide, and I'm going to remove these 3 10mm here. They're all the same size, so for this one you don't have to keep track. And check the guide for any wear or any gouges in it, and put the bolts back where they belong. And now I'm going to remove the timing chain, and this is actually pretty easy. You just want to inspect the chain thoroughly for any cracks or anything. So you want to flip it around, look at both sides, make sure there's no cracks in the timing chain, because you don't want to put a timing chain back on after you've done all this work. You don't want to put something back on that's cracked and could break in the future. So set that aside. And there's actually this really cool trick. You can remove these two 12mm from this guide right here, and you can actually take out the 10s for the water pump. And on the water pump, there's actually threads on the actual water pump housing itself. And you can use that 12mm to actually help push out the water pump. So like right here, I'm going to take this 12 and I'm actually going to thread it in here just like this. And then I'm going to grab the other 12 from the other side and put that 12. But first, I don't want to contaminate this guide, so I'm not going to put it on the floor. I'm going to actually set it up on my table. But you can actually take the other 12 and use that 12 and the other 12 to go back and forth, and it actually helps pull out your water pump, so you don't need any type of a pulley or anything. You can actually like screw this directly in, and you can actually use it to go back and forth on both of those 12mm and actually remove your water pump like this. And it's pretty easy, it's pretty fast. It's the best way that I've found to take out the water pump, because the O-rings that stick inside of the rear cover actually can hold this pretty solidly in there, and you won't be able to get it out. Then you can remove the two 12s from the water pump and check your water pump, and there's a weep hole right here, and you can actually see if there's any buildup that this will actually weep through this hole, and you can check your water pump to see if it's starting to go bad, because it'll start to leak through this back portion right here and come out of that weep hole and into this hole here. And you can remove this 12mm right here on the side of your block, and you can check, and if anything comes out of that hole, you can see if your water pump is starting to go bad. So I'm going to set this water pump over here, put the hardware back with the water pump, and then put the 12mm back with that guide. And then I can start working on the secondary timing chains, and these are the secondary timing chains here. I'm going to use this paper clip to put into this hole right here, but I'm going to have to push the tensioner in first, and after I push the tensioner in, you might get a little bit of oil come out, but this is the same thing for both sides. You're just going to push it up just like this and insert this paper clip into this little hole. It's kind of hard to do both at the same time, especially if you have a rev up. The rev up has a little bit less space to deal with. And now I'm using a crescent wrench on the hexagonal portion of the camshaft and a 17mm on the breaker bar. Now these can be kind of stuck on here sometimes, so just take your time, because this is a interference engine, which means that if you spin these too much, you could bend a valve or damage other internal portions of your engine. And after you break those loose, just remove the bolts. And I like to use a small screwdriver. I've seen other people try to just maneuver this secondary timing chain off of the tensioner, but you can see I'm using a small screwdriver here. Just in between the tensioner, I'm going to put up a diagram right after this. It makes it a little bit easier to take off these pulleys, and you don't have to worry about the chain getting hooked up on the plunger. So here's an example here. You can see how they're using a small plate, is what they call it, in between the secondary timing chain and the plunger. Now I'm removing the valve covers so I can get to the hexagonal portion of the camshaft on this side. After removing the valve cover, I started removing the VTC solenoids that are on the top. That's just 3 10mm on each side. Then an 8mm that holds on this timing chain guide. And this one was a little bit harder to break loose, so I had my friend help me out. I couldn't break it loose by myself, but the other one I got just fine. After we removed this, I moved on to the timing chain, just like on the other side. You can see after I removed these bolts here. Put in the paper clip and the small screwdriver, just like that. And you can remove this bank of the secondary timing chain and cam sprockets. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned the two 12mm that are in the back of the oil pan, just like the front cover, the two 12s that hold on the front. This is the bolt pattern for the rear timing chain cover. You go backwards from 26. And these are the pry locations. After you remove all those 26 bolts, you can gently pry from all of these locations. There's one right here at the top, and then on the other side right here. Just be careful not to warp this back cover. You want it to seal properly when you put it back on. So all these times that I'm prying, I'm just putting very little pressure, making sure that the glue is separating evenly across the whole timing cover. And after you alternate back and forth a few times, it should get a little bit easier, just like right here. You can see it just stayed open by itself. After you go back to the other side, alternate back and forth, try not to drop it. And now I'm taking all the O-rings off of the old heads and making sure that I keep them all so I know which ones need to be replaced. And removing the exhaust manifolds as well as the engine mount brackets. Now I'm going to flip the engine to its side so I can remove the rest of the 12mm that hold on the upper oil pan. Break them loose with a wrench first, and this is the order. You're going to go in reverse just like everything else. And after you break these loose, you can pry open. This is a pry location right here. It has actually a little cutout that's made for something like this. It says not to use a screwdriver in the factory service manual, but there's actually a spot right here next to the dowel pin. And then you can pull off this. And that's pretty much it for this video. I removed the exhaust manifolds, the front and rear timing covers, the timing chains, the sprockets, the water pump, the left bank valve cover. I removed the secondary timing chains, the upper oil pan, and all this is left for the next video. These are all the tools I used in today's video. This Makita gun is actually dead now. It barely works. So if you want to count that, you can. A 14mm here, that was to remove the exhaust manifold nuts. This Makita small impact gun with a 12mm on it, and this, I believe that's an 8-inch extension, 8 or 9-inch extension. I hate saying those two words together. A crescent wrench, an 8mm Allen head bit, a 14mm, a 10mm, this socket wrench, a couple of small flathead screwdrivers, a 12 and a 14 ratcheting wrench, this longer screwdriver flathead, and a breaker bar and a hammer. So this is everything. Oh, and this little gasket scraper. That was just to give me a good idea of where I should start using my gasket cutter, which I actually didn't include in this. Why did I put that tool? Yeah, I used the gasket cutter as well.
It's behind that.
Oh, it's right there. And then that as well. Alright guys, that's pretty much it for this video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button. If you need any parts for 350Zs, G35s, 300ZXs, G37s, hit the eBay stores in the description below. If you want to see anything else, leave it in the comments section, and I'll see you guys in the next video.